Welcome back to the Customer Discovercast. This is your host, Ethan Halfi. This is a very special episode, something I'm very excited about because I'm here with Scott Christianson. He is a technologist, a professor at University of Missouri. He teaches information systems and emerging tech. Welcome.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited about it as well.
Awesome. Today, we're going to be focusing on AI. We're going to start really big picture, how AI works. We're going to basically pick Scott's brain on telling us and teaching us how he does it, because he is a professor of, he's an expert with education. He's going to basically break it down very simply, and we'll touch on a few use cases and the latest developments coming out of Google with AI.
That sounds great. Well, I don't know if I'm the total expert. I'm not the math expert or the engineering expert. We have people on campus that are more expert in the technical details. But what I've really been concentrating is how can we use these in business? How can we use these in startups? Because in many ways, AI, or we'll talk about what AI is, this technology is lowering some of the barriers to entry. So it used to be you had to be a huge company in order to compete in this particular area. Well, now it can be you and me, and we can compete in these areas alongside those big players.
Absolutely.
Which has interesting dynamics. It's good for us, not so good for the big players sometimes. So, let's talk about what AI is. So it's really a broad field where we're talking about a computer that has the ability to make a decision. And these can be programmatic. So you think about your Roomba. Well, it knows that it hit a wall and it can turn around, right? So that's a decision that it's made to turn around. It's programmed by somebody. But often what we're talking about really is a more narrow field called machine learning, where we actually give the computer the tools to learn on its own. There's several different forms of this. There's also one called deep learning, which is another subset. And that's where we enter into the field of things such as neural nets. So you may have heard of this as a way to set up a computer in a way that it can learn kind of like a human being does. There's these little neurons, and they're connected to other neurons within these different layers of this neural network. And it's very powerful because we can often train these neural networks with existing data, and then they can predict or look at other data and determine what it is or what it might be or where it's going. So it's a very powerful tool. Some people think it's much broader than it is, but there's very narrow applications of it where it works remarkably well. So for example, image identification is one that we've probably all seen examples of. And that's what autonomous cars are doing, right? They're kind of learning how the road works, learning what a deer looks like when it pops out in front of it and what to do about that. But there's all sorts of ways that we can train AIs. So one of the ones that I played with a little bit here before we got on this podcast was one called Crystal Knows.
Absolutely.
And
you put me onto that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And I want to see if this AI has been able to predict what Ethan is like. Because what this AI has done is it's taken basically various personality tests, if you will, and correlated those with different LinkedIn profiles, different social media profiles, and been able to then hopefully predict what someone's going to be like. So it says here that Ethan is an initiator. He tends to communicate boldly and think out loud, especially in front of a group. Is that something you think you do?
We're doing it right now.
Exactly. So you naturally speak persuasively in a one-on-one meeting, leading the conversation in a meeting and taking big risks. Probably if you're out there podcasting and doing all sorts of other entrepreneurial stuff with startups, you're probably taking a few risks.
Yeah, by fault.
Gets energized by thinking on his feet, which I know you do because you said we're not going to edit this podcast. We're just going to think on our feet as we go through this.
Absolutely.
Experiencing new things. And it says, if I'm to actually to reach out to you, I might want to be polished and more dynamic, stick to the big picture. If I want to email you, include a brief, interesting story, and make your message entertaining. So it can help salespeople actually reaching out to potential customers, or a startup that is trying to survey potential customers to test their business idea, to really figure out how to narrow that message. Now, it sounds like that was pretty accurate for you.
Very accurate. Yeah, as you were going over things, because I think you took that from LinkedIn, right?
Right.
Because they
Uh-huh.
have a plugin. And not that we're endorsing Crystal Knows. I don't want it to seem like we have an affiliate marketing deal with this. We just genuinely are amazed by this technology. And I was so amazed when Scott told me about this. The J in front of your name always makes me want to say J Scott every time.
That's fine.
But uh, I was so amazed by it. I downloaded it and incorporated it to our Slack HR channel, because now when people join our Slack channel, they can do an intro profile assessment with Crystal Knows. And I did that with mine, and everything that you just said, my three top characteristics were persuasive, determined, independent. I'm a driver. I speak out loud. I get energized by thinking on my feet. All of those things from my personal assessment that I took matched perfectly with what they took from LinkedIn. Do you understand how crazy that is? The degree of certainty that that model has gotten just from almost like a web scraper, right? Like
Yeah, and it
it's
gets
so crazy.
better and better with time, because as you're using that, there's probably some way to feedback into the system and say, well, I talked with Scott and it turns out he is that way. Or no, this is wrong. This is a wrong assumption. So in fact, these models, these machine learning algorithms can get better and better and better. So we can continuously train them or provide some sort of reinforcement feedback into the system so that they get better. Now,
Absolutely.
there's, however, a little bit of a danger, I think, with these types of tools, and there
Mm,
can be a confirmation bias. So, for example, mine says that I'm pleasant and easygoing. I would like to think that I am,
I would
but
agree.
maybe you want to get some third party to evaluate that. You might want to ask my students whether that's true or not. But because we're subject to these confirmation biases, especially things about ourselves.
Yeah.
But it's
It,
fascinating.
it's interesting because, I've also seen you where there was technical difficulties, right? And as someone who is so technically inclined, right? Excuse me, technically inclined, it's interesting to see. I remember your wife was trying to log on to a Zoom meeting, right? And she
Right.
joined our Zoom meeting, and you handled it so patiently and calm. And we've had plenty of those situations with work from home. I've seen people not handle it so so calmly,
Right.
right? So when it says, someone is pleasantly and calm, and I wonder if you agree with that. Um, to a high level of certainty as well. But it's crazy how Crystal Knows can like demonstrate like, whoa, like it reassured their rating on you is
Right.
basically what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So it's fascinating to also think about how this could be used in other ways. So I'm very interested in how AI can be used to help students. So you and I know that the culture of where you work matters. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and it matters a lot. There's some great companies here in Columbia. I wouldn't be a good culture fit. Okay. I'm not going to fit in with their culture well. So for students, being able to determine, well, could you have like a crystal nose for companies and say, well, this company is very hierarchical, it's very rigid, it does not reward risk, so forth and so on. I think that would be a fascinating application to kind of turn things around. But then the same way too, if you're recruiting into your startup, you probably have heard that the first 10 employees are probably the most critical because they're going to set that culture. Are you bringing the right people in that are going to meet that kind of culture fit? And so I think
Absolutely.
that's an interesting way to use these tools. And like you said, there's many other ones out there besides Crystal Knows. It's just one that's super easy to try out and use a plugin for. So
Yeah, that doesn't sound like it's too far off, because if you think about it, they can do assessments on personality from people who lasted more than 3 months at a company, and do kind of training and test data based on that. See the people that were promoted and things like that, and understand the correlation between people that were promoted and not, and determine what kind of culture or personality is rewarded internally in that company, and give the company a kind of personality rating based on that.
right.
Yeah, it
No, I
doesn't
think
sound too
that's
far off. Yeah.
I think that would be, and then even think about high school students. Am I going to fit in well at the University of Missouri? Well, the University of Missouri is huge, right? You're going to be in freshman classes with 400, 500 other students. I teach a class that normally has about 500 students. On Zoom, I have sometimes well over that. And so it's pretty daunting if you're not used to that, or if that's not what you need, or you need more social engagement. So maybe you'd be better off going to Moberly Area Community College first and then coming here, or maybe you'd be better off going to Truman State University up a little bit farther up the road here, a great school, but typically has very small class sizes in the 20s and 10s, right?
Yeah, and that I feel like that helps. It's going back to like the company analogy and university analogy. That would help both parties. It's not like it's a one-sided benefit, right? Because the issue with spending a lot of money on training and resources, whether it's for students with dorm housing or companies with onboarding and HR, you really like you minimize the waste of time of someone coming on to the team and
Yep.
then having to churn as a result. So
Yep.
that sounds really cool. Like that should be created by the end of 2021. They should apply that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I hadn't really thought about it that way as well. Our retention rate is about 75% here, plus or minus. That's actually considered very
That's
high.
very high, right? Yeah.
And but you think about there's 25% of people that didn't come back, and maybe that's because we weren't a good fit for them. Okay, they may have had other things crop up, but maybe that was University of Missouri was not a good fit. So how do we make that fit more easily determined early on? And I also think this brings up an interesting aspect of machine learning or AI. We often think about AI as just replacing people, but in a lot of professions, we're going to see AI augmenting people. So it's going to be your sales team working with an AI to make better decisions. It's going to be a doctor, radiologist working with an AI that can look at my x-ray to make
Mhm.
better decisions. And in fact, medical applications are one of the places where we see AI being used a lot. So there's over 50 AIs that have been approved for medical use, so that are actually deployed today. So the next time you go to a doctor, he or she may say, well, Ethan, um, based on this information, we think that you have certain probabilities of this outcome, right?
Mm.
And so you start to even think about, can you combine that with genetics? Now, that also gets into this area that I always talk about with my students, in that we have this kind of teeter-totter where things are convenient and worthwhile, and they're also creepy, right? So I don't I don't really want, Alexa to have my DNA. I'm not,
Right.
not sure I want that.
Yeah. Like it's the 23andMe and the whole what is it, ancestry DNA thing. Where's that data going to other than the obvious ways of telling us where we
Right.
come from? It's probably going into that training data, right?
Right. Yeah, it
For
could
lab
be very,
rats.
very useful. Could help me head off some disease or something like that. But at the same time, it's kind of creepy.
Yeah, I would
So
say. I would say. That brings me to really like a mandatory touch point, right? So when it comes to AI being coded for specific use cases and then transferring it to general use cases, and you know where I'm going with this. We're going to take the viewers and the audience through a little journey here and walk them through kind of the transition from what we spoke about with very specific use cases, whether it's medical or Crystal knows like DISC personality assessments, to very broad, like kind of replacing yourself and getting your own personal assistant, right? What are your thoughts there?
well, it's interesting because once again, I think for certain things that we do, there are things that the human brain is not good at. Okay. Keeping track of stuff. I use a system by David Allen called Getting Things Done, where you dump everything into a trusted system. I use something called Asana. So
Oh
earlier
yeah.
this morning, I called my mom, and my mom was on the checklist of things in Asana, because my brain is not very good for keeping track of checklists. It's not very good at managing small details, like my calendar. Uh, it's much better at thinking creative thoughts. And that's really where I want to use my brain power, rather than having it deal with scheduling, having it deal with mundane communications with my colleagues. I'd rather offload that to an AI. And in fact, we're starting to see even suggested reply emails. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so some
Yep.
companies are working on that, where I get an email from Ethan and it has this content, and the AI knows that most people that get this similar content or sentiment in an email will respond in a certain way, and may even learn my particular responses.
Yeah.
So that
Wow.
kind of stuff I think is great. But when it comes to more integrated thinking, it may be a little more difficult to see an application that's going to do well at that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's really interesting because we're in a Zoom meeting right now. But if we were in Google Meet, I could turn on captions and their degree of accuracy with predicting what I'm saying and what is displayed on the screen is so good. It's so efficient. And I think what happened was, or someone actually told me, I have a product mentor who was the head of AI, he was the head of, he was the global head of product for Shell, but he also specialized in artificial intelligence. And he told me they used the training data from Google Translate in all of these different dialects around the world, and they use that as training data for that very feature. And then it begs the question of NLP and sentiment analysis, like you said, and being able to determine how successful the meeting went, or what was the sentiment of the person? Were they happy, like customer success wise? And then just last week, I promise you this, Scott, just last week, I feel like I should be calling you Mr. Scott or Dr. Scott, as my
No,
professor.
no.
But uh, just last week, I saw Microsoft is doing that now. They're now using that like through their Microsoft Teams application, but even in-person meetings to determine how successful a meeting was.
Yeah, and I know that Salesforce is also doing something similar with their CRM system, so they can actually start to extrapolate based on Ethan's profile. He's the decision maker on whether you're going to buy my widgets or not. Well, turns out he's a slow decision maker. So let's not count that as a sale for this quarter. Okay, that this may
Mm,
be a sale this year, but it's not going to probably happen in Q1. And so there's lots of ways that AI is being built in these systems so that people can better understand other people.
absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing to think of the future, and it's getting to that point where it's very invasive, right? The artificial intelligence features, it's going to beg the same question of, remember the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, and then that led to a lot of privacy with your personal data. You had to opt out of cookies or opt in actually to be able to share your data. And now it's becoming to the point where you could lock down your API, like for Amazon or Facebook, you could lock that data down so that they can't store it and then send it off to the one of four data conglomerates that then basically purchase your data, right? It's going to become, the point that, if an assistant calls me and it's artificial intelligence, which we'll touch on, I can basically disable that feature. No more artificial intelligence features can talk to me. Like, what are your thoughts there? How are we going to create some kind of legality and regulation around that?
Yeah, and I think that we need to really start thinking about that. And one of the things I've been concerned about, once again, is how AI is going to be deployed in education. Is it going to be student centric or is it going to be institution centric?
Mm,
Is it
yeah.
going to meet the goals of the institution? Now, there's great things about higher education, and I do believe everybody should go to college or university. But um, unfortunately, there has been some capture of these institutions by the rating systems. Okay, so we're ranked. You often hear that for your local institution that they moved up 10 points in the US News and World Report ranking, right? So now you're at 50 or something like that. Of course, they never put out a press release when they go down 20 points, right? So, it's like it doesn't exist that year. But these institutions, um, their goals in moving up in the rankings are not always in line with the student's goal. So there was kind of a scandal a couple of years ago where a number of institutions bought the lists of people that had done really well in the SAT. And they then encouraged them to apply to their institution just so they could deny them.
Oh my gosh.
Because if
Are
I
you serious?
deny highly qualified people, that looks like I'm an elite institution.
That's
Okay.
sadistic. Jeez.
So yeah, it was well, we can get into a whole nother discussion about higher ed. That would be another couple hours. But you could imagine, what if you had your admissions um, software had AI in it that said, I want you to optimize our ratings.
Mm,
Okay. And you tasked it with that. It may do things like that, um, even inadvertently or without some supervision. And so I think we need to be really careful about that. And in fact, I've advocated that we need to have an institutional review board for AI. in our institutions, so that if we're deploying facial recognition, we have some transparency about how that's being used, how that data is being stored. We're not just allowing the security department to figure it out on their own. We need to have faculty and students and all stakeholders involved in these decisions. And unfortunately, that's just not happening right now.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The regulations of it all, it always kind of shifts in one direction, right? And it depends who's making the regulations or who's the biggest stakeholder with the regulations. Probably not the independent parties. It's starting to shift into like the consumer's hands, but for the most part, I think institutions will probably benefit most, right? They're a big revenue generator as far as student loans goes for the government, and if the government is making the regulations, then they have a bias towards assisting
Right.
the institutions. So that's going to be kind of alarming to see how that improves over time. But what I want to transition to is, on a lighter note, right? It's important to have that conversation, right? It's ethical, but speaking of, certain applicable use cases that we already have on our phone, but just the latest developments with them. Do you want to talk about Google Assistant, and then we'll kind of show the audience the latest developments there?
Yeah, so it's pretty amazing. In fact, it's improved even more than I think what you're going to demonstrate here. Uh, that the ability of these phones to be able to understand language in a continuous stream has improved dramatically. And in fact, Google did a huge amount of work to make sure that for their Android devices, to their Google phones, they could actually have all the AI on the device itself. Now, I haven't checked in a while because Siri's kind of annoying, but I'm assuming if I'm not connected to the internet, Siri's not going to work that well, right? But they're actually able to bring that natural language processing down to the phone level. And so it did a huge amount of work to compress that. And that's going to enable all sorts of things. I have here another device, those that are watching it on video. This is called a microbit. And this microbit is kind of like a toy, if you will, for teaching kids about how to, do programming. It has a very simple programming language. It's also kind of drag and drop and lights up and makes little noises and such. But it's gotten to the point where I can actually train a neural net using big servers out in the cloud to train the neural net. And then I can have a little tiny device like this, it's a $10 device, actually do voice recognition. So I can
Wow.
say, turn on the lights, turn off the lights, do whatever. And it has a bunch of little pins here where you can do, connect up external devices so that if it sees a motion, it would know what kind of motion it is. Or you can even, on these small little devices like Raspberry Pis, you can use, you can identify whether it's a cat coming in and open the door or whether it's somebody else's cat coming in and close the door for them.
Really?
So it's really amazing how it's gotten down to these embedded devices. So it's no longer just AI is out there in the cloud on these huge servers that are really expensive. We're able to use those really expensive machines to program a system and then download it to these super cheap, what we call Internet of Things or IoT devices.
How can someone get one of those? Is it the Raspberry Pi website? I had
This is
friends that
called a
used to do that.
microbit, and there is a company, once again, I don't have any endorsement deal or anything like that. It's called Edge Impulse, and they have kind of specialized in this. And I actually do this with my class. So it's pretty cool because I actually have students use their phones and they have accelerometers in their phones. And so Ethan, I would have you scan a QR code that would link your phone into this cloud-based AI. And then I would have you wave back and forth and we collect that data. And then I'd have some other student do the same thing and I'd have them make circles and we collect that data. And then we would have some third student do a circle and we would see if the AI can identify that as a circle just based on the accelerometer data. So it's
Wow.
Edge Impulse. If you want to play with it, they have some really nice tutorials on there. I just watched a YouTube video for an hour and then turned around and looked like I was a genius with my students, which is
Learn it
the
on the
key
fly.
point of being a professor. Okay, get to the YouTube before the students do.
That's
So,
awesome. There's some quote about, I forgot what it was called, not Rayman or something, but it was a guy who faked being a professor and he did it for an entire semester. And they said, "How did you do it?" He said, "I always read one chapter ahead."
right,
And it was a
right.
professor that told me about that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's much truth is said in jest.
That's awesome. Well, without further ado, let's watch this. I think it's maybe like 30 seconds or so, the interaction between Google Assistant. And then we'll talk about it after that, and then we'll go over the next video, which is kind of how he managed a conflict in dialect. Okay.
Right.
All right,
Sure.
guys, let's watch this. Okay. For those of you watching at home or listening on your device, just the podcast, you can still hear this. You won't see the video, but it's just a blank screen anyways. Okay, here we go. Let me turn up the volume, and here it is. All right. So guys, for those of you that didn't know, the person, well, the person, this audio side on the left side, I can't figure out how to stop screen sharing right now. Stop share. There we go. The person on the left side of the screen, it was not a person. It was Google Assistant booking a meeting on behalf of the person, the phone that they were calling. It was Lisa
Mhm.
booking a hair salon. And just the inflections in their voice and the ums and 10 a.m. is fine, the pondering is coded in there, and it sounded like a real person, did it not?
Oh, yeah, it sounded like the real person, and the person receiving that phone call didn't really know that it was, in fact, a computer they were talking to. Once again, that kind of balance between convenient and creepy. Would you want to know if that was a computer calling you?
I would. you know,
Uh-huh.
it's tough to say actually because now I've worked in the retail industry before, right? And working with humans and that's off even for the business world, they say the client facing roles are often the most difficult because clients will never figure out what they actually want, right? So
Uh-huh.
that's why that's they say AI is or no code platforms and stuff like that. It'll never replace programmers because programmers have that innate ability to turn words into what the client actually wants. This begs that question, is that a valid statement? You know what I mean? Yeah, because
Mhm.
it seems like that person had emotional, or that assistant had emotional intelligence almost.
Right, and so, and once again, I don't really wanna go down the dark side too much, but what if we were to use this for political advertising? And I could then micro-target based on what I know about Ethan. So let's say that I'm running for, uh, dog catcher here, and, you're one of the voters, and my opponent targets you with a Google Assistant like AI that has determined that you love hedgehogs. Okay. And so, just to have a ridiculous example, maybe you do love hedgehogs, I don't know, but
Not bad.
calls and says, Ethan, do you know that Scott Christianson hates hedgehogs? And if he's elected dog catcher, he's going to make hedgehogs illegal. Well,
What?
I could micro target a call, and that call would be totally unique to you and would not be something that anybody else would ever hear. Right. So that's one of the problems with these kind of micro targeting. Now, Facebook, that happened in 2016. And you mentioned the movie that kind of talked about that. I'm blanking on it right now, but this idea of being able to use very, very particular micro targeting, in fact, ads that may only be designed for one person. So I think there is some reason we might want to have some disclosure that this is a person, not a person. I also think that it's going to be bad for some applications because if I am a business owner and it says, hello, this is a Google Assistant, I would probably hang it up, right? Or maybe I
Right.
wouldn't if it's making an appointment, but I
Right.
might be inclined to just hang up on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I can't even get my thoughts together because I made sure I didn't watch this video too many times because I wanted to keep it fresh and exciting. And it is, right? Because my brain is still firing off all the ideas. Like, for example, like no one likes doing cold calls. No,
right?
I've never met someone who says I love cold calls. They say I can deal with rejection well, right? But a AI can deal with a whole lot of rejection better, like from a sales use case, right? These people that can handle conflict so well. We'll watch the next video, but picture this: an entire sales team. One person is limited to one phone call per minute, per se. That AI can replicate itself. It could do 100 phone calls in a minute. But what does
Right.
that do for the consumer side of things? The people that they're selling to? I didn't even think about this until I just saw this video. But then consumers, I'm already, I'm sure it's the same thing. You're spammed with all of these, telemarketing calls. How does that, that escalates that, doesn't it? That will complicate things.
Yeah, I think it escalates it. I'm sure some folks would say, well, this is going to be good because we'll take all this database about Scott and we know that he is probably needs a new jacket. And so we'll call him up and see if he wants to buy a new jacket. And so that personalized ads, there's some advantages to that. And I would say Amazon is usually pretty good about saying, hey, you might want to also read this. And often I click on that and go, yeah, you're right. I would like to read that. So there's some advantage to that for the consumer, but I do think it's an interesting dynamic. So could you have your frontline cold calling being done by an AI, if I was an insurance agent or something like that, and then use that to kind of go through our first part of the sales funnel and say, okay, well, here's our qualified leads because Ethan is interested in new car insurance or he's interested in widgets or whatever it is, and then move that up to a person. And of course, you can imagine you're always feeling better about calling somebody that you don't know when you do know they're interested in your product, right? So if
Right.
someone has recommended that you call them or has recommended you to them, it's a much more reassuring feeling to get the conversation going than making those cold calls.
Right. Yeah. And let's tune into this video. Before we start the video, I'll share my screen again. Imagine now if this AI, this Google AI, had some sort of integration with Crystal Knows and did could do a disc personality assessment on this person and then cater to that assessment, speaking to the person based on their profile traits and how they want to be spoken to. Then that creates a whole different dynamic to where the quality of these telemarketing calls are much more efficient. You don't have to worry about, someone who's stressed out on the other side because no one's saying yes to them. Google Assistant doesn't get stressed out, I would think. Maybe you could code that in there, right? But it doesn't sound
Right.
very beneficial. But listen to this. Let's hear it. Oh, how crazy is that? And I hope I'm
Yes.
allowed to show this is Marcus, right? Brownlee. Yeah. So I hope I'm
Marquez
allowed to
Brownlee.
show.
Yeah.
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 So
So
he's a legend, and I saw his interview with Elon, and he built on that towards the end of this video. He says, "I would love to talk about the dangers of this with Elon Musk," and he said one other representative, I forgot who was kind of like the AI lead he was speaking of, but yeah, I'm on the same page. What are the risks? We need to address that really quickly, huh?
No, it's so we have this idea that we're fearful of some sort of, Terminator and all these things we see in the movies, that's going to be some sort of malevolent AI. And I think it's more dangerous is that we may be manipulated because um, we don't like to admit it, but we are in some ways easily manipulated. There's that old expression that it's easier to fool somebody than to convince them they've been fooled. right?
Absolutely.
Because we have all these sorts of biases that are built in where you kind of anchor to a certain idea, even if it's wrong, even if you've been fooled by it. So can an AI fool you into thinking something is true when it's in fact not? And I think that's a big danger as we move forward and think about this from a political or geopolitical standpoint as well. So we talk about cyber warfare not being just breaking into computers, but actually psychological warfare. So Russia's been using this on the Ukrainian border, where they will actually find your social media accounts and then will send you messages. They're not using an AI right now, but they'll send you messages saying, "Hey, Ethan, I'll be at your house tomorrow afternoon, and here's what I'm going to do to you." So think about
What?
these types of things being deployed even in psychological warfare, if you will. So it's interesting times, to say the least. And once again, I hate to keep on going to the negative, because I'm actually very optimistic that these are going to empower people to do some amazing things, and to address some of the big challenges that we face as far as education, healthcare, climate change. All those things are going to benefit from AI.
Yeah, I agree as well. On that same kind of sentiment, to where there we're always going to develop as a human species. We're always going to develop technology, and there's always going to be. It's like developing cars, right? Like cars have helped out millions and millions of people. Well, of course, some people use them to go on, highway chases and do robberies and stuff like. There's always
Right.
going to be people that abuse technology, but the use cases for AI, as far as the upside of it, is just so high that we should not like rule it out. I know people are scared of it, and people like you, thank you so much for educating people on it, because it really does ally some fears and it creates a lot of clarity on kind of the direction that AI is going in.
Well, thanks. Well, I think that if you look at any field, no matter what field you're in, you're going to be touched by AI. And it's not just AI, but you start to take AI and you combine it with blockchain, or you combine it with 3D printing, or you combine it with robotics. Then you get into some really amazing things, and those are going to take a little bit longer to be deployed, but you're going to see all these kind of technologies of the what some people are referring to as the fourth industrial revolution are
Mm.
going to have enormous impact on us in the next 20, 30 years. I often tell my if you look backward, students, if you look backward, the last 40 years have really been defined by globalization, shipping containers, moving things from one country to another, different factors of production around the world, and all that kind of good stuff that we talk about. But really, going forward, it's going to be technology and technological disruption, and how we manage that disruption, that's really going to affect their professional lives.
Right. Regulating disruption sounds counterintuitive, but it's necessary, right?
Right.
So,
Well, there is
actually,
kind of a weird cycle that goes on. So if I'm a company and I can automate every, get rid of workers, that drives my profit up. But the unemployment rate that might cause decreases the overall productivity of the nation or the state, and that then decreases economic growth. So there's a lot of complex things going on here, and a lot of which I don't understand. I have to ask my finance friends to explain it to me from time to time. So,
it's interesting. Are you familiar with Clayton Christensen?
oh yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah, I was gonna say your last name reminds me of him because also Christensen. But
Right.
rest in peace, by the way. I think he died early 2020, right? He
Yeah,
was.
I believe so. Yeah.
That's when I knew 2020 was going to be a bad year. By the way, when he passed away, he's one of my favorite um, like leaders in the entrepreneurship space. One of the most ethical and just smart like thought leaders in disruptive innovation. He wrote the theory on disruptive innovation. He pioneered it, created the class at Harvard. But now more than ever, we're starting to realize that so many things are poised for disruption, perfectly
Hmm.
poised for disruption. Legality, well, legal services is one. It costs like sometimes $200 every 30 minutes, and it's always billed on like a 6 minute increment, right? What can you accomplish in 6 minutes? That's painstaking when you're in a tough situation and you need a lawyer, whether it's divorce and stuff like that. And you have to really speak in 6 minute increments because you know you're going to get charged, So there's a lot of AI use cases for that. I've spoken with several founders through the YC startup school that are tackling that problem head on. fitness. For one, it's very expensive, and I've spoken with people who have similar technology to what you're talking about with accelerometers and goniometers to ensure proper form with just wearing an
Right.
Apple Watch. It's amazing. So seeing how AI is going to accelerate that process, which is already occurring, but really going to put kind of the power in the hands of the consumer. What are your
Yep.
thoughts there?
Yeah, and I think the two big industries that have not been disruptive, that has predicted would be disruptive, are education, my area, and healthcare. And so I think we may see some major disruptions in these two areas, and how that plays out will be very interesting. But I think there's a lot of companies that are very interested in this. These two areas. So Google is one, Apple's obviously one. Tim Cook has said that Apple's legacy will be healthcare. So
Mhm.
has really staked a claim in that area. Google is now offering, I think it's an 8-month course you can take um, on how to be like a IT help desk person. And they
Okay.
say that they will count that as a 4-year degree
Wow.
when you apply at Google. And they're also going to come out with one in project management, the area I teach, where it's just an 8-month intense program, but it will be one that will help you be able to manage projects like in a startup, but also will give you a credential. So, do we see higher education credentialing? Essentially, that's what we do, right? We give you your degree, and that is your golden ticket that gets you into various HR departments. Well, if other HR departments say, "Oh, well, wait a second, you got a golden ticket from Google or from Apple," well, that sounds pretty good for us as well. That's going to be a major disruption. And frankly, even though I work in the area, I think it's time for disruption. So,
Right. Absolutely. It'll be very exciting. We do have to wrap up. I wish we didn't. Man, this has been being completely honest, this has been my favorite episode by far. Honestly, this is why I started this podcast, to speak to people like you about topics like this, and really just getting the word out there, and hopefully just communicating kind of the big picture of things, so people can formulate their own thoughts and capitalize on these things to invent the future. So, without further ado, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure and honor. And tell the audience how they can reach you.
yeah, so I have a website at Christianson, that's with a sonjs.com. I also have a monthly newsletter. I try to make it monthly, where I send out all the kind of things I've discovered, like that Edge Impulse I was mentioning, things I'm using in my classes. It's not really any advertising or anything like that. And you can find that at frt.news. And you will get, it's a Substack um, newsletter, and you can subscribe there. And uh, you can unsubscribe at any time. I don't know why you'd want to, but
I'll link that below. So it's frt.news.
yep.
Got it. Okay. I'll make sure to link that in the podcast description. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.